Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this webinar series, Families Celebrating the Sacraments, From Formation to Transformation. Today's presentation, A New Way of Sacramental Living, is part 2 of a 3-part series of webinars brought to you by the Strong Catholic Families National Partners, which is comprised of the National Catholic Educational Association, the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, and the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership. I'm Andrea Kopp, Assistant Director of Professional Development for NCEA, and I'm happy to be your host today. Just a few housekeeping notes as we get started. Please note that your microphone connections have been muted. If you have questions or comments during today's presentation, please send those through the chat box that appears in your GoToWebinar control panel. To ask a question, use your mouse to click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click send. Our presenters will be coming on webcam today, and just to let you know, you can expand that viewing area by clicking and dragging the borders of those boxes to make them larger or smaller. If for some reason your viewing area disappears, just click on your GoToWebinar icon on your toolbar and it should come right back up. Our webinar presentation will last about an hour, and there will be opportunities for questions and answers. You can post those questions or comments for presenters at any time, and we will be live tweeting today, so if you'd like to join the conversation, please use the hashtag NCEA webinars and be sure to tag all of the partner organizations. Immediately following the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief survey about your experience today, and we thank you in advance for providing us with this valuable feedback. You will receive an email within 24 hours with instructions on accessing this recording and the presentation materials and certificate of attendance. You can also download those files now or at any time throughout the webinar in the handout section of your control panel. To get us started, I'd like to introduce your moderator for today, Michael Tyson, Director of Ministry Formation with NFCYM, and also the National Coordinator for the Strong Catholic Families National Partnership. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for leading us today.
And thank you, Andrea, for getting us started. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, well over 300 who've registered for this particular webinar series, joining hundreds of others who started with us last week on the first part of this series that was presented by Bob McCarty and a panel on the title 13, Engagement or Exodus. In that session, Bob presented some very important research that was done by St. Mary's Press on disaffiliation and how that is impacting the church, but also raising some interesting questions about what brings about this disaffiliation, especially at a young age. In this session, session 2, A New Way of Sacramental Living, our presenter, Dr. Sean Reynolds, will be expanding on the impact of that and what we as a church need to be doing about it. And in a few more days, on October 17th, we'll have the third part of our session, New Paradigms in Play. And in that, we have a panel of leaders across the country who will begin to look at some of the practical applications of what we're talking about in terms of a new way of sacramental living and how that plays itself out, or how it might play itself out in parishes and schools around the country. So to get us started, or before we get started and I introduce our presenter today, I'd like us to take a moment to begin in prayer, and especially given the events of the last few days of what has transpired in Las Vegas. We think about the tragedy and the loss that so many families have experienced in their lives, and the shock and dismay that we all have about the place of such horrific loss. And we hold all of those who are affected, both near and far, in prayer, as well as the families who are in our minds and hearts right now, as we sign ourselves in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord of life, bless and sustain our families. Hold us close. Keep us connected and protect us from all evil. Gift us with love and patience for one another. Help us reconcile that which divides us and celebrate all that unites us as one family, where you live and reign now and forever. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. I now would like to invite Dr. Sean Reynolds to please join me on screen. And as I introduce him, now Sean and I go back a long, long way. I think I lost Sean there. I think. Yeah, there we go. But we lost your screen sharing. So I need you to click on your share screen image so you can get your PowerPoint back up.
Share screen image.
It's that middle button in there. About there we go. And now, yeah, now you can get that started up again.
Okay, good.
And so while you do that, I'm going to introduce him. So Sean is an author. He's a professor. He's been involved in full-time Catholic ministry and diocesan, parish, high school, retreat settings for so long that you can call him very veteran, which also includes a lot of wisdom. And you're going to hear that wisdom as we go through this, as he goes through this presentation. He holds degrees in theology and organizational development and applied ministry leadership, and you're going to hear the wisdom of all those degrees in this presentation as well. And he was really one of the primary force in getting strong Catholic families started back in 2010. Actually, it was 2008 or 9 at the time we were working on it.
Yeah, it's almost 10 years. Yeah.
Yes, it has been. He's a national leader and presenter on the faith prospects of our children and our families. He lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, with his wife of 35 years, Leah. And he's a founding partner of Mustard Seed Consultants, which you'll see a little bit later on. And we're just delighted to have Sean join us. And I'm going to just be quiet now and turn it over to him because he has a lot to share. And I'm sure you're going to be very interested in what he has to say. Sean?
Well, Michael, thank you so very much, and Andrea and the panel which is coming up. It's been just a delight to work with you, and a shout out too to Dr. Bob McCarty, Grandpa Bob, good friend and colleague who for many years has led and taught so many of us. Thank you, Bob, for that, and also for lighting a fire. I felt a fire lit under me last time by the research, and it was great to have that reignited. And to be able to build on that in our conversation today. So, Bob, thank you. For everybody, a little bit more about me. It really has been about 40 years, taught high school religion, 10 years in full-time youth retreat ministry, then more than 27 years in parish and diocesan ministry, sprinkle in some regional and diocesan and national stuff in there, and then you've got me. So I'm happy to bring that to bear in our conversation today. And finally, all that led up to what we're calling Mustard Seed Consultants, my good buddy Dobie Moser and I, because we are dedicated to these kinds of conversations, conversations in so many different ways and so many different venues amongst so many different kinds of people about the future of our church. And that's the core mission, really, of Mustard Seed. So happy to be here representing him and Mustard Seed as well. So that said, they're the panelists whom you will meet shortly. And that said, we are today celebrating the Transitus of St. Francis of Assisi. Those of you who have Franciscan devotion or history know that very well. A quote from St. Francis is this one on the screen. Let us begin again, for until now we have done nothing. Can you imagine speaking those words on your deathbed as he did, essentially saying, the baton is being passed. It's yours now. Don't look back, look forward. It's your ministry to carry to the next stage. And I think those are really good words for us to begin with today in the spirit of St. Francis. So a little pre-quiz would be this. Please, if you would, raise your hand only. Okay, I know you'll look ridiculous wherever you are probably, but Raise your hand only if you woke up in the church today. Think about that for a moment. Did you wake up in the church today? Raise your hand if so. Raise my hand because I woke up today, as probably most or maybe all of you woke up today, many at least, at home in your domestic church of your home, and therefore you did, in fact, wake up in church today. Not the church that immediately comes to mind, probably as you think of cold pews and the church building. We're going to be really unpacking that today, our mission, our own role with respect to the domestic church, and connecting that with sacraments to take as much advantage as we can of this rare opportunity, what I frequently call the convergence, the amazing convergence right now of Catholic teaching and the research. So let's get after that. My takeaways, probably if you were on, you had your own takeaways, but my takeaways from Bob's presentation were these three. As you can see on the screen, I'll elaborate on those in just a moment. First of all, the usual stuff isn't working. That gets us off the mark in this conversation. Secondly, if in fact the age of 13 is now when kids are opting for or away from faith, well, that seems to me to be rock solid evidence. Where are they catching their signals? Where are they getting their trajectory? They're getting it from primarily parents and family, which is what all the research has led up to and told us, and actually what the church has told us as well. So it's no surprise. And that leads us to the third point, which is that research and Catholic teaching agree. However, you may agree or disagree, depending on where you are, that for many of us, perhaps most, you can't speak for all, that's too broad brushstrokes. We, I think, continue to ignore what our church has taught definitively, consistently, magisterially, all those heavy-duty words, namely that parents are primary in forming the faith of their children. In fact, we know from the NCEA nothing else comes close. I think the Catechism uses the word indispensable. And Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis speaks of the very same thing, which I'll get to in a minute. And my suggestion to you at this moment in this conversation is that we ignore this reality at the peril of the future of the Catholic faith. Not just for young people, but the Catholic faith here in the United States of America. That said, sobering thing, this presentation is all about opportunity. And I think we have some wonderful opportunities that are just within our reach. To frame this conversation, please bear with me a moment because I'm kind of an old guy. Bob's been around, we've been around for a number of decades, and we have seen this coming like a train out on the plains of Kansas. I don't know where this photo is from, but I grabbed it because it's how I imagine it. Maybe a wisp of smoke out there on the horizon, but this research, not just the St. Mary's research, but research of all kinds has been coming down the tracks at us really since the 1970s. Probably before that, but what comes to my mind is John Westerhoff, sociologist, theologian, his book, Will Our Children Have Faith? Certainly all of the research in the 1990s that Christian Smith did and the National Study of Youth and Religion, book Soul Searching, Souls in Transition, 2014, published Young Catholic America. We've never had such a wealth of research available to us. The sobering thing is, though, that the train's been coming down the tracks, and it is upon us now. It's no longer a wisp of smoke on the horizon. It is, in fact, well, it occurred to me to say, we're starting to see the whites of the engineer's eyes and seeing the dramatic impact on the non-affiliated young people who are leaving our church sometime after the age of 13 and then on into young adulthood. And so it's up to us, as St. Francis said, it's up to us to grab hold of that and to do something with it. And so the remainder of this presentation really is about what we'll do. Hailing back to Bob's presentation last time, he said, in fact, that our children and our young adults are exiting the church, and from the age of 13, younger ages than ever before. And so I propose to you simply this, and it's the basis for this presentation, that you need look no further than parents and families for the linchpin or the key to, if we're going to really understand how to unravel this, that seems to be job one, to go there where our parents and families are. Even parents, in fact, who are still with the church, largely, I believe, don't know how to. I didn't. I never received training, and I don't know who does. And in leading the domestic church of the home, it's largely something that is still in work. It's still in progress, and there isn't, at least that I know of, a kind of a master plan for that. And so, even with those adults whose young people are in our churches today, it's sobering for us in that we haven't grabbed hold of this research and said, if parents, in fact, are the ones who are primary, how can we assist them to do what only they can do at home? So, my friends, if you think this is new thinking at all, by the way, this is a document, some of you are, I'm sure, aware of it. The Bishops' Conference produced this document back in the 1980s. It was revised, I think, in the early 90s, A Family Perspective in Church and Societies. And some of us have been around long enough to know that we were given marching orders to put families at the center. In fact, that's a companion volume to this with practical suggestions on how you do that, how you make that happen. This is sort of a gut check for us now, decades later, frankly, in terms of how much or how little parents and families are, in fact, at the center. Let me say this, too. If we're in the habit of blaming parents, here's the thing. We need a good, hard look at ourselves, look in the mirror, and to revisit what the contents of this document were back then. Things like this. See this slide here. Every family is sacred. The families have ministries. The family activity is holy. Family is a believing and evangelizing community. Well, when I asked you to raise your hand if you had awoken in the church today, perhaps we all should have immediately said, well, absolutely. My family life is sacred. Our family has a ministry. I know that this family life is holy, and we are a church. Secondly, the notion of this document and subsequent ones has been that it's the family life cycle that ought to be the guiding template for what it is that we do. Not a school model, not a PSR model, not a youth ministry model, but the family model that preserves the integrity of the family and doesn't kind of slice and dice it up into pieces, discrete pieces, but takes families as a whole in all of their diversity, all the different shapes, forms, and sizes that families have. They are the fertile ground of our faith these days. And that's what research and the church are telling us. So, Bob wrapped up his presentation saying that we need a national conversation on the research. And I agree 1,000%, if you can have 1,000% of something. In fact, I think it's long overdue. We needed this conversation desperately, and I know some places are having these conversations. So grateful for this webinar to continue to pursue conversations. And in fact, my role today, I think, is to seed those conversations. The mustard seed thing is just to throw some seeds out and see if it stirs conversation. That's what we need, national conversations. But I would suggest that we need them to be guided conversations around four things, around four key elements, actually that converge with what in Strong Catholic Families we developed as the change model, because we went around the country and presented research, as Bob did, trying to evoke, that's the first step, to evoke a response that this is urgent, we need action. But then we realized that what we need to do is envision a better way of being church, a church with parents and families at the center, not marginalized, not optional, but indispensable, to envision what that is. And that's not enough either, that we need to be thinking about equipping, being at the service of the domestic churches of the home, much in the same way that we have so many publishing houses and operations going on in dioceses and parishes that are there to sustain our programs. Equally or more so, what we need is some trial and error, some sharing of best practices. What did you try? Does this work? What is really working? What's really happening in terms of assisting our parents and families becoming the leaders of their domestic churches of their homes, and for us as church leaders to admit that ourselves that we're not center stage, that we are there at their service, leading to evolving then into a church with parents and families at the center. Now, I'll leave it up to you to determine, since Strong Catholic Families, or since the document was written about the families back in the 1980s, what's our progress like? And perhaps a bellwether of that, that's what the NCEA suggested, an indicator of that is what Christian Smith suggested in Soul Searching, that, well, if you want to see how we're doing in our families, look at our kids. And Bob told us last time what's happening with our kids. So what do we do with that? That's where we're headed. Unpacking a little bit these 4 steps. Oh, and I neglected to talk in the middle piece there, and in the cross in the middle, of course, is evangelize. And our notion of that is that evangelizing, encountering Christ in the sacraments, in one another, in the poor, in teaching, but in prayer, in worship, in song, and celebration, that evangelization experientially needs to be part and parcel of all of those steps. It's not like administrative stuff that we need to go through. It is discerning, listening, being a part of the body of Christ, but having conversations that move us forward so that in 20 to 30 years, there aren't people sitting here having a webinar, looking back, wondering, well, 20, 30 years ago, they identified this, and really it's pretty much the same, except worse. That's a nightmare, isn't it? Nightmare scenario. So, to launch into this seeding conversation, I have some things that I'd like to say about what we need to say goodbye to and what we need to say hello to. Old habits, new habits, and in fact, name some of the things that, by virtue of conversations that we've been having for years about Strong Catholic Families, to identify for the conversation those things that are toxic or seem to be toxic to lifelong missionary discipleship. First is a consumer-provider model of ministry. If you've read Rebuilt, you'll know that in the first chapter, the authors talk about the conversations the pastor and youth minister had, and the recognition, the realization that both parishioners and the staff were coming to church expecting a consumer-provider model. And we've come to identify that as one of the significant roadblocks for any future change, that there's sort of a quid pro quo. Well, I send my kids to Catholic school, I should get, or I've sent them to PSR, so you guys deliver the goods, or Sunday Mass ought to do X, Y. Do you follow me on what I mean in terms of consumer provider? Or looking at us gets in the tyranny of programs that we seem to be caught in an endless cycle of repeating the basic programs that we've always done. We'll get a new book or throw in a different kind of retreat. We'll tweak some things in it. But do we get around to asking, where's this all headed? And is it resulting in lifelong missionary discipleship? That's the key question. And we're too darn busy and too exhausted, frankly, to even face that question. We don't want to because we're spent. Then there's sacramental prep, and unpacking that a bit. You go everywhere in the country, everybody talks about their sacramental prep program. Let me in this webinar suggest that we ought to completely jettison the notion of prep, because it suggests, both to us and to the people receiving the sacrament, that the sacrament's the end point, not the launch pad for a life lived in faith. endpoint versus launch pad. We'll unpack that in just a bit. To get us off the mark in terms of that, my suggestion is to rethink these prep programs that heavily front load classes and instruction, refocus our efforts and activities to after the sacrament, when the goal is to be living out the grace of the sacrament. When this workshop was titled, this webinar was titled, A New Way of Sacramental Living, that's what we're talking about. Living sacramentally after baptism, after Eucharist, after matrimony. Silos I'm going to circle back to in just a minute. When, just to bring this home, both our boys are married to these wonderful women, and I'd like to present this metaphor to you. I thought, as they were being married, the image of the space shuttle taking off came to mind. Wow, they're being launched into decades and decades and decades of sacred love and intimacy and mystery and service, and their children, and just the thought of this mission that they're on is came to mind. Here's the thought experiment I'd like to suggest to you. You see the person on the right, the control. Imagine we're in the control room in Houston, okay, and we've done our months and months and months of prep, got those astronauts off, hit the button, they're heading up into space, and we're pretty psyched about that. We give each other high fives and say, oh man, that's great, until the next launch, and we can rest a bit, let's go out to dinner, let's have a couple beers, and we're sort of off the hook. And then there is this voice crackling, like we've abandoned the control room, okay, that pretty much so, the parish secretary might be there, but we're on to another program, do you see? Houston, we have a problem. Hello, Houston, hello, anybody there? And perhaps, now I don't want to be too hard on us, but because we're really trying, we really are, but perhaps Tom Hanks, if he were calling into one of our parishes, would hear this response. Are you registered with our parish? Or I think we have a series on space travel. The theory of space travel is coming up. Yeah, it's coming up in Lent. And so we have that for you. Feel free to plug in. And you're welcome to that. Do you get the point? So the sense is that we have a pattern of ministry, don't we, that concludes rather than launches our people into a life of discipleship. Time to rethink that, I believe, and to put families at the center. So, again, we need these 4 conversations. Bob presented the evoking piece. We're doing a little bit of envisioning and talking a little bit about equipping today, and in the next workshop, especially the next webinar rather, where the panel will be talking about how to make this vision a reality, and then evolving, moving into uncharted territory where the family and parents are leaders of their domestic churches of the home, and they're equipped to do so because we are there. We get that. We have their back. We're supporting them. We're behind them 100%, and they know that. And their children are marinated in faith at home, and then come to liturgy and come to whatever programs we have as faithful people rather than as skeptics. That's the vision. Here is a bit of a snapshot to sort of summarize just visually what that might look like if you envision those arrows being the family life cycle that we mentioned before, the normal, predictable stages of family life. And the sacraments are distinct moments in that cycle, and the faith community is at the center of it, so that, again, the consumer provider model, I don't get a sacrament, I celebrate a sacrament with the community, and all that fuss, all the preparation, all that stuff that we did, it's all looking ahead to living a life as a disciple afterwards. Let me talk about that just a little bit more, what that might look like. What are the things that you'll need, that we'll need? My suggestion is that we probably want to start with matrimony and baptism. Well, you might say, well, why the heck do that? Those of us who have been puzzling over this for a long time realize that if you start at confirmation, you'll need to work your way backwards to first Eucharist, and then work your way backwards to penance, work your way backwards to baptism, and then you're on to matrimony. That's the beginning of a new family's life cycle. So to start there. So some suggestions. Again, I'm just seeding the conversation. What might this be like? Seeding the conversation. Let me suggest this, that we'll need mentor couples. Now think not just of baptism, think not just of matrimony, but all of our sacramental ministry. We're going to need mentor couples. But thinking of young families, seasoned parents and grandparents, Bob mentioned them last time, who are walking with young couples. In other words, not just ending at matrimony with focus and pre-K and all the rest and maybe coming to the wedding ceremony, but it happens afterwards and leading up to baptism and then beyond baptism. The job one of those mentors is to fall in love, with young couple, to listen to them, to share meals together, become the spiritual aunts and uncles of their children, have their backs during hard times, pray with them, celebrate, befriend them for life. By the way, this is what Pope Francis refers to as accompaniment, part of it anyway. Maybe we'll find ourselves organizing a lot of opportunities for young couples before and after they're married and with their first child and children, helping them find each other to develop families of families, so that the resources and support, the learning, the love, the challenge, the faith, the wisdom about diapers and craft beer is intimately connected with how do we be better spouses with one another, and how do we rear our children in the faith. That is happening in some places in the country, and it's dramatic, and it's fun, and exciting, and lovely, and wonderful, life-giving when we turn that corner and move into this kind of church. Thirdly, since they are primary, parents are and families are, we know that, church teaching says it, and our activities are at their service, we church leaders, too, we need to slow down and make space to listen to them, to fall in love with them. Isn't this a love story that we're a part of? Absolutely. To fall in love with them, and especially listen to their stories, their struggles, their worries, their joys, their victories, be a part of this life that we share. Let me offer you this quote from Evangelii Gaudium. Pope Francis said this: the church will have to initiate everyone, all of us, priests, religious laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other, reflecting our closeness and our compassionate gaze which also heals, liberates, and encourages. So we'll be building up the domestic churches at the home. We'll be making sure that this message filters through all of our communications. And in fact, you see what I call love languages of missionary discipleship. We're doing these things. Just take a look at this list, if you would, and think about what would you add to this list. What is it that you would put onto the list? And what are we good at? We can do these things. It's simply a matter of changing our mindset so that we're not focusing on classes. We're focusing far more on the family and equipping parents at home and at church, of course, both and in a partnership. If you'd like a bit of a summary slide, there it is, connecting the dots, putting parents and families first, using the baptismal catechumenate as a master template, and then planning our sacraments with this kind of ministry in mind, not front-loading them, but teaching ourselves and the rest of our people, all of us, that the real life of faith is following. That's where we're headed. finally, let me share this real brief story and I'll wrap up. Talia Wurzelbacher, daughter of very good friends, Bob and Cindy Wurzelbacher, came to her parents one day and said, after she left their little prayer spot in their home, this is the way this stuff happens. 3 years old, she's older now, but she says, hey, Mom and Dad, Jesus spoke to me. Well, what happened? What did he say? And she responds, he told me he loves me. That's wonderful. It's fantastic, Talia. A couple days later, she comes back, says, Mom and Dad, Jesus talked to me again. Mom and Dad, wow, where's this headed? What did he say? And Talia says, Jesus said he loves me and he wants to be with me my whole life. Wow, that's awesome. Wow, you keep praying, keep going to that little prayer space and doing your coloring and doing all your stuff there. A few days later, she comes back, Mom, Dad, Jesus talked to me again, and Jesus said, but I didn't quite understand it. He said, you know, Talia, I love you. I want to be with you in your adult life. I wouldn't be with you in adult life. I messed that up. I'm sorry. I wouldn't be with you in adult life. And so she says, I didn't get it because isn't Jesus an adult? And of course I said, no, Talia, he meant he wants to be with you your whole life. And that's the message she gets day in and day out. And so let's conclude with Pope Benedict. He said, no more business as usual in his lineamenta on the new evangelization, marching orders, there we are, and Pope Francis, who said, I dream of a missionary option, that is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that all our ways of doing things, all our structures and languages, what we do is channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. I'll leave you with those pieces. Hopefully I've seeded your conversation, and let me just turn it over to Mike and the panel.
Wonderful, Sean. Thank you so much for that. Those thoughts, those challenging thoughts. I invite the panelists to come on as we're thanking Sean, and we're gonna see Sean in a little bit later after we hear from the panelists. But as Sean said, you know, this is these are some challenging thoughts, and the questions always come to us in terms of how do we do this. So what I'd like to do is to just introduce our panelists. Actually, I'm just going to call them by name. They're going to introduce you, especially this first one, because she has the longest title in history in the Catholic Church. Diane Kledzik out of Tampa, St. Pete's, and one of the members of our National Strong Catholic Family team. So, Diane, what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, just after you introduce yourself and take a deep breath, if you would then just give us a quick reaction. What you hear from Sean that spoke most to you, that you want to react to?
Thanks. I just say wow first after that presentation. I'm Diane Kledzik. I'm from the Diocese of St. Petersburg. I'm the associate that directs evangelization, small Christian communities, and adult faith formation, and I also coordinate strong Catholic families for our diocese. One of the things that you know, I just kept thinking, I have not been in ministry as long as Sean, but I'm close. And yeah, this is not new. And I'm just so surprised, you know, with the church teaching, with all the research that clearly has been saying parents are primary. They're the most influential in terms of faith of our children. Also the baptismal catechumenate being the model for all catechesis, and catechesis does not equal just religious instruction. It's a part of it, but it's much more than that. I just can't believe that we're still seeing so much concern over content versus an emphasis on conversion. And you know, I just think about how important building relationships are to conversion. That's the first step of evangelization. It's a key portal to developing a relationship with Jesus. And so, you know, unfortunately, you know, that emphasis on content of the agenda or religious instruction becoming more of an emphasis than developing relationships, more than that process of conversion. I'm surprised, and I heard that loud and clear through what he was saying.
Great. Thanks, Diane. Andrew and Terry, great to have you join us again for one of our webinar panels. Please introduce yourself and let us know what you're thinking right now based on what Sean said.
Sure. We've been married 100 years. Actually, Thursday we're celebrating 42 years.
Awesome.
Yay!
And we've been involved in marriage ministry, marriage preparation, enrichment, and so forth since 1982. So we've been at this a long time.
Well, 35 years, yeah.
And you know, Sean's presentation just it affirms what we have observed through the years, in that while many elements of what we do as church, particularly around the sacraments and preparation and so forth, have to be programmed, so to speak. And even in some of the innovative things that Strong Catholic Families is presented, it's presented in such a way that it's a particular order, so to speak. When we think about what happens to us as sacramental people, particularly as a married couple, that mystagogia that happens throughout our lives, it's about how we engage in the whole community. It's how we connect with the folks around us, but also how they enter our lives and make a difference for us. And in order to do that, particularly in marginalized communities, that we need, as church, we need to be willing to go upstream a bit, that things won't necessarily follow the same flow, especially in communities where marriage has become, you know, people are more ambivalent about it. And it may not necessarily happen, but families are forming nonetheless. How are we enlisting married people in the ongoing outreach, the ongoing evangelization of people, leading them to the sacrament of marriage, not waiting for them to decide to, but really modeling and witnessing it for them?
That was the first thing I asked my kids. Do you know what you're on for when you decide to get married? It is not all about you.
Yeah.
I'm like, Diane, I agree. I can't believe we're still going through this. This is nothing new, this the domestic church, and the fact that we should have learned some lessons. And one of those lessons is that, you know, this is an opportunity for evangelization. Yeah. And our marriage and our participation in Marriage Encounter even was an evangelizing experience for us. And when we closed the door on a couple who wants to marry, being the Wizard of Oz, so to speak. Who are you?
Right.
You know, and not being hospitable.
Are you registered?
That's right.
Not no way, not no how, you know.
But the thing is, that is not hospitality in the way we want to deliver that to our couples. So if we're thinking on those terms, I think we'll have more couples entering into the church.
And that idea of relationships is so key. It's do we develop relationships with the people that we're reaching out to?
So critical. It's definitely, we definitely need to be speaking that love language that Sean talked about, and that is a relational language, not the laundry list or the checklist language that we're so accustomed to, and unfortunately in so many places. Let's jump to a school setting. Carrie White, a campus minister, and I hear a Twins fan as well, maybe.
Oh yes.
Okay.
I'm ready.
So Carrie, how does this apply to a school setting? I'm very curious to hear that about that.
It's interesting, especially as I'm the director of campus ministry at St. Edward in Lakewood, Ohio. So I have 960 boys. We're just right outside of Cleveland, so it's a party all the time. But I think especially for us, as we're not the primary sacrament givers, at all, but especially the post-sacrament formation, I think, that Sean was talking about is really important for us, because that's primarily where we see our students, especially in our diocese, kids get confirmed in 8th grade. So as they're coming in as freshmen, that's a real opportunity for us to kind of, enhance isn't the word, but build upon the sacrament that they've received. And it's very interesting to ask the kids about that experience, especially as they get older. And so I think this idea of are we encountering them and accompanying them with what they've already experienced, and then especially too with their parents, how do we intentionally engage their parents in some of these same things, and especially inviting them to be a part of some of our, especially our all-school masses that we have, and some of our other smaller sacramental celebrations. How do we do that together with the parents and the kids? Because so many parents just kind of expect us to provide all the faith formation and all the, and when the kids go to mass at school, that's good enough for them. We do it once a month because of our space, but like that's enough for their kids. So how do we kind of work with the parents to understand there's even more that they can be doing, or should
get out of that consumer provider model that Sean talked about, that is so deadly, such a dysfunctional system that is created, and how to get out of that. It's not easy. It's certainly not easy, because we've built many a system on top of that. So
right, yeah, definitely the easy way to do it now.
Michelle, all the way from LA, we're so glad to have you join us, and tell us, introduce yourself and tell us your reaction to what Sean was saying.
Hello, my name is Michelle Youssef, and I'm a catechetical consultant in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Most recently, I was the director of faith formation at a parish for 8 years, where our program was intergenerational in its focus, with households participating together. I previously worked at a Catholic elementary school as well as a Catholic high school, and at the diocesan level in catechesis. Sean, you mentioned the work of Christian Smith at the University of Notre Dame. That study not only indicated parents as being central to the transmission of faith, it also indicated that parents often don't realize their influence over their children. In the interviews that were done, parents often said, "My kids don't listen to me." So the study indicated that an important part of the successful transmission of faith by parents was their ability to have conversations with their children about faith, that attending Mass or attending events at the parish no longer were enough, that it was important for parents to be able to message and interpret for their kids why we do these certain rituals and how faith is relevant in their lives. It's my experience that parents want to engage in faith conversations with their children, but as you said, Sean, they often feel ill-equipped, or they haven't been invited, or perhaps they haven't been affirmed in their role as the primary educator of faith in their families. Father Frank in the last presentation spoke about the changes in our Catholic culture, and I think it's important to remember that one of our roles is to constantly be reminding and affirming parents of their role, because I think sometimes they just don't realize that they have the greatest influence over their children. I can tell you that after explaining our intergenerational program to parents and letting them know that they would be attending sessions with their children, I have never had a family say that they were not interested in participating. Many parents say to me that it's the only thing of its kind that they get to do with their kids, and that they value the quality time spent with their children. Most households today have 2 working parents, which means their time with their children is precious and limited, and we should be nurturing that and providing meaningful opportunities for them to be together rather than apart. Our role should be to help facilitate faith-sharing experiences that help to model rituals and conversations and prayer and activities that can be replicated in the home, where instruction is done through discovery. the Holy Spirit's always at work in people's lives, whether they're aware of it or not, and our role is to help them to see God in their everyday schedules. Faith is not something separate from life or something we have to make time for. Many of our families are already doing faith in their everyday decisions, and it's helping them to realize and to message and to articulate the ways that faith and God are present in their everyday lives.
Right. It's that helping to take families deeper in conversation, and that goes back to what Terry and Andrew were saying about that relationship approach. And so, in fact, Terry and Andrew, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, but I see a lot of folks are chiming in on the chat line, and keep doing that. Keep sending questions. I'm going to go through the panel one more time, asking them to go a little more with some of the application, because I know that's always the question when people are watching webinars. When I'm watching webinars, I want to know, okay, so tell me what's working, what's not, or something I can take away based on your wisdom, your experience of what you've learned from this. I'm gonna go back to the panel and ask a little bit of that, knowing that our final session is going to be focusing on that, but I want to take advantage of that, the wonderful wisdom and experience that's here. So keep sending in your questions and your comments while we're going through this one more time. So Terry and Andrew, turn it back to you. What is it like when the rubber hits the road here? Okay, given what we've heard, what's your experience? What do you have to offer us?
We have benefited, quite honestly, as ministers, lay ministers in the church, of being part of a marginalized community and operating in the margins and dealing with the headwind that comes your way in trying to be part of the larger church community, but being in a marginal community. And what we find is that what doesn't work very often is we just have old definitions and understandings about marriage and family that relegate many families to being dysfunctional. And that's nowhere to begin. We need to begin affirming their goodness. We need to begin affirming what's working and not what's not working. So it's really about maybe redefining and coming to a different understanding and expectation for marriage itself and the role it plays in the community. We talk about a symbiosis between the couple and the community, that we are here to bring the light of Christ to the world. Now, if we know that as a couple, wow, that's powerful. Mm-hmm. Just to embrace that as a couple is so enriching. It's intimidating, but it says something about who we are. And then when we are enlisted in the church to be able to let that light shine in a formal way, whether it be through marriage prep or any other engagement we have in the church, it takes it even further. But that doesn't happen to everyone, and it can. It's just that our understanding and expectations around marriage is so limited, it's so private, and we don't talk about the public role that we play and the expectation of it. We expect
you're really challenging people to go back to their baptismal call to claim that, and live that out, live out that light of faith.
Exactly.
Absolutely, and marriage is the sacrament of service, just like our holy orders. We're here to serve, and when we talk about the sacrament and the mystagogia of marriage, we have to allow them to, well, at least we have to show them how to do this and how to serve. Yeah. And we have all kinds of restrictions and hoops that couples have to jump through. Those that are being confirmed, they have to jump through so many hoops, and one of those is those service hours, right? Right? And so what is wrong with a couple
doing some service.
Doing some service to prepare them for that ministry, that sacrament that they're entering.
For that ministry they're entering.
It is a ministry, right? And so this is a way to help them say, you know what, I want you to serve and observe one another, come back and let us know how did that go, because this is going to be their ministry. How could they be a mentor couple if they haven't experienced that?
And to see themselves and experience themselves in a powerful role in the church.
And claiming one of those aspects of being domestic church, of being that finding your ministry and sharing that as a family, as a domestic church. I want to jump to Michelle. I'm going to pick on you next, since you came the farthest. But in the meantime, I just want to let people know we are running a little bit late on here, but we're going to keep going. If you have to go, you're going to get a recording link of this webinar within a few hours, and you'll be able to view any part that you might miss. So you won't miss anything if you have to leave, but we hope you can stick around. So Michelle, I'm going to go to you and see what you have to say about this application of what you've been hearing.
Well, we often use the term lifelong faith formation to mean catechesis is a lifelong process, but the same should be true of ministry. Jan Reagan talks about the concept of a learning organization. She describes it as an organization that is continually expanding its capacity to create its future. So one never arrives at being a learning organization, just as one never arrives at being a lifelong learner, and one never arrives at being an evangelizing community. In striving to make our church a learning organization, we have to recognize while the message of the gospel doesn't change, the means and the approach of our delivery system should adapt to and be reflective of our communities. In order to move away from the consumer provider model, we have to shift people's understanding of church away from the idea that the church is something separate from themselves. Because in fact, the church is a community of disciples, and all the members of the parish are part of that community and therefore share in that call to discipleship. That means that our programs actually belong to the households of faith. And if they in fact belong to the households of faith, then we have to involve them in the planning of our pastoral initiatives, asking them simple things like what topics of faith interest them and what days and times work for them. It also means welcoming them in at whatever time of year that they happen to call us, and creating an environment where households feel safe to ask questions of faith or doubt or challenge without judgment, and where children of all ages and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all the members that make up families and households are welcome. To be effective in our role as ministers, we really need to listen and to invite. We need to learn the stories of our families, get to know their gifts and their needs, and invite and encourage their involvement, as both of you spoke to. No one merely attends anymore. Everyone should have a role of involvement, because belonging leads to believing. I think Lisa Anslinger said that in one of her books. The sacraments are merely a starting place for deeper involvement and greater responsibility, where older kids mentor younger kids and help to facilitate and instruct. As pastoral ministers, we should be asking households, what is your reality, and how can we make your reality and our environment big enough to include your reality? That means embracing and engaging all the components of what it means to be family. As Sean mentioned, opportunities for marriages to be nurtures, parenting topics, special needs, but all with a faith lens. It means that there aren't 6 or 7 different programs. There's one program. There's one faith formation program, one community that everyone is a part of. And some of those people might also be preparing for sacraments. So that the faith formation, the intergenerational piece, is the core of the program, the foundation that sacrament preparation is built on, not the other way around. The sacraments that way are not the end. They're just a step along the journey.
Great. Michelle, those are some beautiful thoughts, and I really like the fact of you basically taking us back to, you got to start where the person is and find out what their needs are, and walk with them from that moment, and hear their story, because everyone has a story of faith, and they might not know it yet, but until you start listening or asking the right questions, it'll start to unfold. Diane, why don't you? I know you do a lot with parents and a lot with sharing stories and that sort of thing. Tell us your experience on that.
You know, I would love to piggyback on what Michelle was just saying and what you were saying, Michael, because, you know, when I was talking about building relationships and focusing on conversion and the baptismal catechumenate, you know, what is one of the first things we do? You know, somebody comes to us and says, you know, I'd like to find out more about the Catholic faith. We sit down, we talk, we, you know, interview, survey, you know, we talk with them. And we listen. We let them talk to us. We listen to their story. You know, do we approach the other sacraments at any time? Is that how we start? We sit down and we say, tell me your story, you know? Do we do that? I think we need to do more of that. From there, we find out, well, what are the best needs for this family? We can find out the individual needs of maybe a child who's preparing for a sacrament, but what are the needs of the entire family? How can we discern what's the best route of faith formation overall for a family unless we speak with them? How are they growing together? Tell us how you're an evangelizing community in your home so that we can learn from that also, and we can share that with others because we don't keep it inside. But how do we create that atmosphere to listen to people's stories? You know, so look at the sacraments. I think it's a great time. You know, what if we sit down with the family who has a child preparing for baptism, who has a child preparing for confirmation, Eucharist, reconciliation, for marriage, you know, and we say, you know, tell us your story. And then as we are engaged in sacramental ministry, is it you know, do we dismiss the importance of introducing the parents to one another, as well as to maybe whoever the catechist is in that session? How well do they know each other? I think I have a harder time of opting out of a group gathering when I'm known by name and I know other people by name. It makes me want to stay. It makes me want to continue to belong. And so if we're sharing, you know, about who we are, and then we're given the opportunity to share faith and life with one another, to make those connections, you know, lecture, religious instruction, yes, bring it on, and then give us a chance to share with one another, what do we think about that? What do we think about the frequency of receiving reconciliation? How often are we doing it? Why would I want to do more or less? What benefit would it have? You know, so we might hear somebody share that, but then to share it with one another, where somebody's saying, you know, I haven't received this sacrament for 20 years. Another person says, I do on a regular basis. What's the give and take here? You know, how can you help me to want to engage in this sacrament? You know, so how are we sharing faith and life? Because, and not just in sacramental times, but in everything we do in the parish, every time we gather, are we connecting faith and life? Are we connecting the scripture and the church teaching to how we live? And if we're doing it in the parish, we're going to learn how to do that in our home. And if we're learning it in our home, we know how to do it in our home, let's share it with everybody else in the parish. Great.
I don't know if Lisa Gomes is watching this webinar, but she's on most of them, so I'm guessing she is. But she's the one I always think of when I hear about telling your story, because in Hawaii they had the tradition of talking story, and they use that term. We need to sit down and talk story, meaning we need to get to know one another and share our journey with one another. And you don't really enter into much of decision maker or anything until you talk story with one another, because then you know the person's context and a little bit more about them and where they are along their journey. As Michelle was saying, this is all a process. You know, it's not ended. You know, we're all in process. So that's just some thoughts I had while you were talking. All right, Carrie, you're batting cleanup here.
Oh boy.
And after you, I'm going to invite Sean on so we can and Andrea, so we can hear some answer a few questions before we end today. So go ahead, Carrie. Tell us how this applies to the school setting.
I think for us in the schools, it's a lot about because we don't celebrate all the sacraments together as a community, but particularly I know for us, our all-school masses that we happen once a month, and then reconciliation that we offer with the kids is especially important in just making sure that those celebrations were encouraging, that they're an encounter for the kids to be able, the guys, to be able to encounter Christ in the church in a new way that excites them to want to go out and continue to do it. And one of the things that I've really tried to do is to add that to our smaller settings and being really intentional about how we're celebrating Mass and reconciliation on our retreats, especially so that the guys, when they have that positive experience, they can go back and tell their friends, or they can think, oh, I went to confession on this retreat I just had, and it was a pretty good experience, and I could do that again in my church, and maybe I'll take my dad with me because I can't drive myself, or maybe my older sibling wants to come, or I'll drag her along a younger sibling, or I have a really young kid, my younger sibling's getting ready for First Communion. Well, I just remember going to reconciliation. And so if we can give the kids here a positive encounter and celebration of those sacraments, and we've had students who have brought their families or who've kind of said, I want to go to Mass on Sunday, will you come with me, Mom? And have started bringing their families to Mass with them. I think is probably the most, it's not important, but one of the best ways that if I can make sure kids are encountering Christ in a unique way and then kind of foster that, then they'll kind of become the evangelizers, which will leave me with a lot less to do, which is the perfect goal in the end.
Somehow I don't find that to be true, but but I love what you said, Carrie, about being intentional, you know, and leading people to an authentic encounter with Christ is very much and needs to be an intentional act. Otherwise, we just fall into old habits, as Sean said, and patterns. So I'm going to invite Sean back on, and also Andrea, and I'm going to have to get off because we only have 6 cameras available that'll work at one time. But Andrea's been collecting some of the questions that I'm going to ask her to just offer up to the panel, and we only have a few minutes to do that, but I'd like to address at least a few of them. So let me get off, and Andrea, come on and ask away. There we go.
I think you're muted still, Andrea.
Andrea, you're muted. There we go.
Okay. We had quite a lot of chatter in the chat box, so that speaks well to all of our panelists that they've inspired so much conversation. And I'm going to try to combine some of them where I can. A lot of them related to the idea of empowering parents as catechists. But where do you strike the balance between sort of the accompaniment and the relational piece with the content? It says, how do we balance between relationship and conversion and knowledge of the faith? Any comments on that?
You know, Andrea, can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me chime in on that and just reframe it a bit. A friend of mine once said, and he actually served as the director of a diocesan religious education office, he said, the issue really isn't content, the issue is motivation. You follow me? So if we overplay the content card, the instruction card, our experience tells us, we know this to be true, that it saps motivation from people. There's an emotional intelligence piece to this that is extraordinarily important in terms of the ministry that we do as catechists, as youth ministers, and supporting our parents and families. And if we look at this through the lens of lifelong, as Michelle said, ideally lifelong faith formation, well, it frees us from the kind of the onus of trying to shoehorn the catechism into the head of a young person in preparation for confirmation prior to their departure. I mean, we're self-defeating, you see what I'm saying, in our activities. So my take on that is go with emotional intelligence first, go with relationship first. That's what Jesus did. He told stories, had dinner, made friends, made disciples. I can't remember a single time when he invited people into a school. So I love Catholic schools. That's the first thing. I love it. I mean, our kids went all the way. But if that's the only thing that we do, then we're adrift.
I think also that sometimes, especially when we're trying to do something in a programmatic way, and any institution that's teaching is going to do that. There's some level of pedagogy that you got to have, that there will be those times when there will be a conflict between process and content. What I mean by process is, the mystagogia, the conversion, the relationship, the new awareness of this sacramental life and how it's affecting me and things like that. Well, it might not be on schedule, but always let the process have primacy. That we need to not necessarily dispense with the context, but put the process first. Does that make sense? It's probably oversimplified in how I said it, but I think in many ways that is what we tend not to do too often, is that we're locked to a schedule. We're locked to, we're on chapter 5, and that doesn't always work.
Well, Carrie, we have a question that is geared toward, I think, campus ministry as a starting point, but I want to open it to anyone else that would like to comment. Someone had written in and talked about how in their high school, they have some students that opt for sacramental prep in their parishes, and others choose to do so in their school environment rather than a parish. So how can Catholic schools offer confirmation prep in particular, or better partner with parishes in this journey?
That is a very good question, and I think a big debate kind of is how that should look. And I know our parishes are pretty intent in saying it has to be for the parish, but I think there's ways to bridge that, especially because in the schools all the students are taking theology classes, and one of them is a sacraments class with the bishop's curriculum. So is there, and I think that's an important bridge to be able to make too as a support to the parish, the balance between sacraments happening in part of a community, but then also your school is a community as well that you're in. So I think part of it is knowing what the parishes are doing and the curriculum that they're, not even the curriculum, but the ways that they're approaching the sacrament, and try and work with that along with some of the teaching that happens in the classes naturally. And I'd be really curious to know kind of how that is set up, particularly in that diocese where we are. It's pretty frowned upon. Students will ask us all the time about celebrating or doing the confirmation prep and then just going to their church for the Mass. And the parish has been pretty clear, and we're usually pretty quick to say that that is the parishes kind of control the confirmation prep. But I don't know that it always needs to be that way, because I think there's really beautiful ways that we can work together, and sometimes we're just afraid to do that because it's my spot, and then the parish have their own spot when it's really our spot for these kids and their preparation and evangelization together, I think.
Silos.
Right, and how do we knock those over is exactly true. And some of it, I think, comes from I'm developing really pretty good working relationships with some of the associate pastors and the parochial vicars in our nearby places, and so it's being able to work with them and say, well, maybe can you come in and do some of our teach some of our sacraments classes, and lead some of this stuff for our students, so that they begin to see that we're all kind of encountering, taking this journey together, and we're not competing really, but working together. I'll compete with the other high schools for students, but the parishes, we're all trying to do the same thing, so we should be doing it together.
Any other thoughts on that? All right, you did a good job then, Carrie. All right, this is another one I'm trying to combine a couple of questions in. Any commentary on how to sort of implement some of these suggestions for non-traditional family structures, single parents, young adults who maybe are in between parishes? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can weigh in on that a little bit. I'm so glad that conversation came up, because our families are not monolithic. They are diverse, and they come in lots of different sizes, shapes, and packages. And if I hope I didn't misrepresent that this vision is solely for typical two-parent, 3 kids, whatever families, which has been a treasure. I remember a young woman came to me after a presentation I did, and she broke down and cried, and she's holding down 3 jobs and has multiple kids, and she's trying to do church stuff and keep the faith together, and it's a tremendous burden. That said, if I could just talk a moment about mindset, if we're in the programmatic mindset, the tyranny of programs, the question is, well, how do we get them to come to our stuff? If we're in the ministry mindset, the mindset that we've been discussing today, then we're at their service and asking them how we could help. So I'm not going to answer the question directly, other than with a process, which is simply to develop a relationship and to ask them. Now, the pushback is going to be, well, we're too tired, we're too exhausted, because we have these programs to keep going, and that is a problem, because we're stuck. We are stuck in program mode, and it doesn't let us. I talk to ministers directly and mentor them. I don't have time to have a relationship because I'm a program driver. And 70–80% of my stuff is administration. There it is. That's the tyranny of programs. That's why I put it first. When Father Michael White, and I can't remember the other guy from Rebuilt, remember the first chapter of Rebuilt, they didn't get anywhere until they took on the tyranny of programs and the consumer provider model. But once you get off the mark, then church starts to happen. And it's a community, and it's wonderful.
I think it also, and I'm not sure whether this is my interpretation of Pope Francis, or he actually said this literally, but that notion of encountering people with compassion rather than judgment, acknowledging their goodness rather than pointing out their dysfunction. When we point out their dysfunction, whether it's not being registered, or you're living together before marriage, or you got kids without marriage, or you're what they call multi-fertility families, things like that, it says, yeah, you're welcome here, but check your mess at the door, and we need to really communicate to them, we want the mess. We're not afraid of the mess. And we can handle the mess. The truth is that we're really good at handling the mess when we're courageous and generous and loving. So I think that's a key part of this.
Okay, we're gonna do one final question, and then I'll invite everyone to make a final comment, because we are quite a bit over the hour. Any suggestions on how to incorporate some of these ideals when diocesan guidelines state that we must use an approved program or curriculum?
Yeah, well, I don't think that the problem is the resource. I mean, you have a resource, use it, but what do you do with that resource? You don't forsake relationships because you have to get through this program. You know, use the resource, but it's the catechist, it's the person working with them, making that come alive. You know, if our entire sacramental ministry revolves around a text, I would put that into question, because it's about a relationship, it's about evangelization, it's about encountering Jesus Christ, it's about making disciples. Anybody can absorb material, even an atheist can absorb material. Does that make them a disciple? I would say no. And so what are we doing differently that is going to create the environment for conversion to be just a typical way of how we do things here in this parish? And we welcome that. And we build relationships. We connect faith and life. We form community. We live as disciples. We continue to grow in our knowledge and understanding of what it means to be a Catholic Christian. And then what do we do with that? How do we act as a steward? How are we in solidarity with others? You know, that text or that curriculum, that is just helping. It's one of the resources. It's not the only thing that we do as church.
Well, thank you all so much for your comments. I want to give you just a final word each, and I'll call on you so we're not fighting over the audio. Diane, why don't you go first? Final words for our audience today.
I would just say, let's, you know, what if we have the attitude that says, what's the most we can help you to do to encounter Jesus Christ? What are the most ways that we can help you connect faith and life, that we can help you meet one another, that we can help you meet Jesus, that we can help you be part of the community? What's the most we can do in this time of sacramental ministry?
Andrew and Terry?
Yes. When it comes to our ministry to couples, we need to look a little bit outside of those that we see in the pews as well. We have to be hospitable. We have to look at couples who are even ambivalent about marriage, invite them to learn about the sacrament, encourage them, like Sean said, evoke, and they will get them excited about the possibilities of what living the sacrament of marriage could be about. And so many say, oh, no, you're encouraging them, or you're saying it's okay for them to live together if we include them.
We always say, don't flex muscles you don't have. We don't have that kind of influence. But we do think that we can lead couples who are ambivalent about marriage, and those who are young, you know, and just creating a sense of what marriage and family is like, that we can lead them to the sacrament of marriage by our witness, you know, just being present and being engaged and in relationship with them. But it requires work on our part as a married couple, as a family.
Thank you. Carrie, any final words?
I would say, I just think, especially for us in schools, just thinking about the relational ministry is so important with the students. So how do we take that into the more formal, sacramental kinds of settings, whether it's a mass or even if we're helping parishes prepare kids for different retreats, especially the parish schools probably, or for the different sacraments. But how do we take that relational experience and turn it into a place that they can encounter Christ and then be empowered themselves to take that encounter out to their broader community is something that I'm going to really continue to think about and try and implement even more in the work that we're doing out here.
Great, thank you. And Michelle?
Well, I want to go back to that question about instruction. because I think that there are plenty of ways to do instruction through relationship. We all know that kinesthetic learning is some of the most effective ways to learn and to remember and to hold on to information. And I think that, you know, I'll give you the example of a child with a speech delay. They have to figure out the words for themselves. We can't teach them how to say the words. We can help them along, but it's the same in any kind of learning. We have to discover the learning for ourselves. And if conversion comes before catechesis, then people will seek out the catechesis. And the catechesis will evolve through relationship and through conversation. So just because we're talking about relationships doesn't mean we're letting go of the idea of instruction. It's just about learning through relationship and through conversation and through doing and through discovery.
Thank you. Well put, Michelle. And Sean, you get the final word.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful way to wrap up, I think, because that is an abiding challenge for us. And I feel the pain of those who are saying relationship and those who are saying content. And like so much in our country, we can find ourselves in silos and polarized from one another, taking positions. And Michelle, I really like your response because, and Carrie's before it, we're all, I think, here talking about partnerships, which require setting those silos aside and presuming the best of our sisters and brothers who are in leadership positions, pastors at the diocese, etc., and having conversations with them. That the next step isn't, you know, there's a slide on the screen there. Joby and I are committed to conversations. It's through conversations that we fall in love with one another. We also differ with each other, but we learn from one another. We develop an appreciation for what God is calling us to. We discern together. And perhaps that's a good way to conclude today, where we started, seeding. All this is about seeding our conversations between all of us who hold dear this faith of ours and the faith of our young people.
Very good, and I want to thank all of our audience for, there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to, and I'll be happy to share those with the panel, and you have Sean's contact information here on the screen. I want to thank all of our panelists for their time, especially we went half an hour over time, so thank you all for hanging in there, both on the panel and in the audience. Special thanks to Michael behind the curtain there for moderating this session and leading us. I want to remind everyone that I will send this recording out and within 24 hours, probably sooner, so you'll have this to view again or to share along with your certificate of attendance. And I want to invite everyone to register for part 3 of the 3-part series. I'll include that link in the follow-up email, so if you have not seen part 1, I'll include that as well to have the full picture here of what we're trying to do. So thank you all again. Please visit ncea.org for more webinar offerings, or you can register for the rest of the series at NFCYM's website as well. Have a blessed evening. Thank you all.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.